I'm here with two seminal teachers of the Contemplative Way, Father Richard Rohr, the founding director of the Center for Action and Contemplation in New Mexico, and Tilden Edwards, the founder and senior fellow of the Shalem Institute for Spiritual Formation. So, welcome to both of you. It's a privilege to be with you today. You were both young when you started this work in the Contemplative Way. Tilden, young professional, and Richard, a young religious. If you could reach back into your memory, back into the heart space of what you felt was being invited for you, what drew you to this contemplative path? What invited you to be about this particular work? Tilden, let's start with you.
Thank you, Carol. 40 years ago, all of us who are seeing this who are old enough to remember that time at least, know that it was a different time in the religious world than today. And I was part of that way of being in the church, way of being religious, way of being prayerful, and something just seemed really deeply missing. And yet, since no one else was talking about that very much, there wasn't a word for it, there wasn't a way for it, and yet as I began to explore the long, deep contemplative tradition and began some practices, it came to me that this was where the whole was. My basic underlying hunger for something that I could not even name, because contemplative was not a word that anyone named unless you were in a very marginal place in some contemplative community. And it was just kind of an alien word to so many people. So I felt that, I wanted to go deeper myself. I tried to do that in some different locations. I had many years of experience already then of going to monasteries and retreats, and yet even as those were presenting what we would call contemplative today, it still seemed like they had lost something of the oral tradition and deep lineage that heart, to me, of the contemplative revelation is about. And so, I gathered some people together that when I was at that point working in an ecumenical organization that was dealing with social issues primarily in Washington, D.C. And the Shalem Institute grew out of that beginning when we found 20 people who came together, agreed to stay together every week for a couple of hours and have a retreat together. And one thing led to another. Those people began to see this is filling the hole that they were feeling too and had no name for. And little by little, so much more began to evolve and develop, not only with us, but in the larger culture, where what was so marginal for so long was becoming becoming awake again in ways that we had no idea where it might lead. At first, just this is good private prayer that's, really deep, and then beginning to see this has revolutionary implications for the whole society, for the way every institution is grounded, not only the church or other religious communities.
Thank you, Tilden. Richard, was there anything similar or different for you?
First of all, because I joined the Franciscans young, we always had the word contemplation. And from my first day in novitiate, we had to, on our knees at that time, I'm talking about 1961, we had to start the day in 20 minutes of silence. Amazingly, what we do now in a sit instead of a kneel. But I know I wouldn't have called it that, but those were the first hints that there was another way of knowing. And that it wasn't come to by discursive logic or reasoning or added perception, but it almost came unmediated. Now, I didn't have any theological education then, but I knew there was another way of knowing. That's probably, and you sort of kept it to yourself because you weren't sure you weren't fooling yourself, or you really didn't know how to talk about it. Then, as I grew up and got educated in theology, spiritual theology, particularly the discovery of Thomas Merton, he, for so many of us, gave us the vocabulary that this is an alternative consciousness, that it's not just thinking about God with your reasonable mind, but actually a different mind. And so we started the center in Albuquerque almost 26 years ago now, with much the same intention. There's got to be a way to teach people this mind. And then the sad discovery that so much of the church, you said it too, didn't seem to know about this mind anymore, even though it was our tradition. And so many of us studied the history, how we had it, how we lost it. Jesus, I think, assumed it and practiced it, but he didn't teach it in a systematic way, although there are some hints that he was trying to teach it. But because it wasn't systematic, the way theology became, we sort of dismissed it. And in short, by my time, contemplation in most Christians' mind meant being an introverted personality, liking quiet, sometimes not liking people or not liking noise. I mean, this is a complete distortion. Why would introverts have a head start on understanding the gospel? This makes no sense whatsoever. So that needed to be unpackaged, and I think we're 20-some years into that unpackaging now.
Well, now let's take that word contemplation. Can you unpackage that for us? I mean, what are you talking about here?
Well, let's start with the Latin word. Literally, contemplat is seeing, not thinking. And some of us understand, I contemplated that. I looked at it. It really means. So it's a more holistic way of accessing the moment than just the left brain. I like to call it undefended knowing. Undefended knowing, where you keep the screen open, you refuse the dualistic, antagonistic, it's either this or that, which is the way most people prefer to think. They don't know it. So when you refuse this, it's either this or that, you get your usual defenses out of the way of anger, agenda, fear, judgment. The more you can remain undefended and keep the screen open, I think you have easier possibility of contemplating a situation.
So, undefended knowing. You know, that sounds very vulnerable to me. What kind of risk-taking or courage does that invite from those who want to enter the contemplative path?
I think you just named the heart of the problem, that the ego is very defended. That's almost its definition. And vulnerability, exposure, self-disclosure, that isn't our natural language. And I think you've just named the primary reason people don't try to learn the contemplative stance, or if they do learn it, they run from it. Because to stay there, even for 20 minutes, undefended, without returning to my obsessive, compulsive, repetitive patterns, that's a lot of letting go. And who wants to do that? If there isn't a wise teacher to tell you it's okay, and it's not only okay, but it's better, it's good, who is going to go there naturally? I don't think so.
Tell
Well,
us, Dylan, yeah.
I think one thing that really helps is for people to come to understand that our ego and our mind's thinking are not the only ways we can know something, the only places that tell us where we and who we are. We can call it by different names, but there is this whole historic faculty identified in contemplative tradition that we can call our spiritual heart, which is not just a matter of willing and feeling, but it's a matter of knowing, of a quality of intuitive awareness. And when a person is in that quality of presence, with the help of others that can let them trust what's happening there can develop that sense of inclusive, compassionate, undefended, direct in touchness with what is really there and going on. And that provides a whole different possibility for a way of then living in human community and of going deeper in your own awareness as the ground for making your decisions and for letting go what gets in the way of that deeper, freer, confident way and place of being.
Well, I'm so glad to be here with the two of you and to hear more about these years of experience with the contemplative way. Because when you describe it, it sounds almost like a foreign language, an unknown land, and an experience that's unfamiliar. And really that direct in touchness with what is really real is almost an awakening.
And it's a way of finding our true home, finally. So it's not alien once people really touch it.
I love what you just said, Tilden, that contemplation is a way of finding our way to our true home in a place that's not alien once we touch it. But when you started this work 40 years ago, how was the word contemplation understood, and how was it received within the culture and the religious landscape?
I would say 40 years ago, it was largely unknown except as a word. Now, those of us from the Catholic, Orthodox, maybe Anglican tradition would have been a little more familiar with the word, but most mainline Protestants, not even the word, because they emerged in Christianity after we stopped teaching it. As I've often said, once we got into the food fights of the Reformation, where each denomination had to prove that it was right and the other was wrong, that was the death of contemplation. There was no room to teach it. There was no interest in it. We had to be defended. How could you have undefended knowing when everything was about proving the previous Christian group were heretics or wrong? So the Protestant tradition emerged in that. It's not their fault. It didn't mean that God didn't love them and they didn't love God, but they did lose perhaps the main access point for the higher level of a mystical reading of the scriptures, a spiritual understanding of the scriptures. Individuals came to it through suffering, through trial and error, but there was no longer, by 40 years ago, 50 years ago, the systematic teaching of it. It was discovered now and then by accident, by people who read the early Eastern Fathers or the mystics, and there it is. And how come no one says this anymore? So it's about as traditional as you can get, and yet now is considered dangerous and revolutionary.
So I want to thank the two of you for rediscovering the contemplative lineage within our own Christian tradition, the mystical tradition, and for bringing this forward for all of us today. Thank you.